Welcome. This is a short midweek devotion from the United Methodist Church in Littleton, Illinois. I feel like I'm taking my mugshot. I thought I'd better tell you that I don't look as pretty as normal this week. I had a slight accident this morning, and I had to choose either don't do these videos for probably a couple of weeks and hide in my bedroom or something, or else just tell you I had an accident, as if you couldn't guess. Last week, I gave you a list of, in my humble opinion, I could easily be wrong or miss something. I gave you the 10 books that all Christians should be familiar with. Well, today I'm going to do a similar thing. I'm going to talk to you about, give you a list of 10 authors that I highly recommend. I'm going to begin by giving you the criteria that I'm using for picking these 10 authors. One of the criteria I used was all of them had to be important in my personal life as a Christian. That is, they had to be influential and make an impact on me. The second thing these authors had to do was they didn't have to be easy, as I said. Last time I said they needed to be, deep, but they also needed to be easy to read. I threw that out this time. But one thing they did have to all do is that they had to be of such impact that every book from that author is worth reading. I didn't put all of these authors on last week's list because, all their books, because I could have just filled the list, the 10 book list on any one of these guys, pretty much, or these people. I have a feeling it's going to be hard for me to get through this list and that you're going to get bored before I do. So I'm going to break it into 2 weeks and give you 5 authors this week, 5 authors next week. And between this week and next week devotion, you'll have 10 authors that I highly recommend anything that they've written. Well, let's get started. It's probably not going to come as a surprise to very many people that one of the names on my list is going to be C.S. Lewis. The author was he was an atheist, university professor, keen intellect, sharp wit, a flair for writing. He was outspoken. He was converted to Christianity and became one of the great apologists of his day with his series of radio programs, and it led to his book, Mere Christianity. He also was one of the best children's authors with The Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe and the Chronicles of Narnia series. He also had a science fiction series, all with the Christian undertone. He also was a person that was a kind of a crusty old bachelor gentleman that found love later in life and wrote this book about Surprised by Joy, and talks also about what true joy is in our lives. His wife, he was not married very long before she got cancer. And when she got cancer, he was just honest and wrestled with his depression, and she passed away. And he wrote a book, The Problem with Pain. And in that book, or in his writings and stuff, sometimes he said that the question was not, is there a God? Because he now was Christian. The question was, so this is God? When it comes to temptation, he writes this wonderful book, the Screw Tape Letters, that deals with a fictional book about an older demon in hell writing to a younger demon on how to tempt this person that was becoming a Christian. Then he wrote The Great Divorce, a book about hell and about our separation from God, and on and on and on. Just everything C.S. Lewis writes is worth reading. And it's not terribly expensive and not hard to find. There's still a lot of them, and most of them are in print today. He's one of today's best read authors also. He kind of bridges a gap between Protestant, Anglican, and Catholic, that gap in there, so that people from all sorts, Christians from different backgrounds, read him. And he's a theologian and an author that's worth just picking up anything. I can recommend anything that he has written. Okay, now I'll move along from someone who has almost universal acclaim, C.S. Lewis, to someone that could be kind of controversial, Eugene Peterson. He's best known for writing the Bible paraphrase, The Message, which was probably his best-selling book. He also talks about, along with a co-author, Marva Dawn, about the unnecessary pastor. And he talks about the contemplative pastor and returning to the art of spiritual direction as opposed to being the CEO of a growing corporation as a church. He himself didn't believe that bigger was always better. And he had several volumes of special interest to church leaders and pastors. And in those volumes, they were finally bound together into one fairly large volume. They had several books wrapped up into it. And just about everything he writes is challenging. I'm not sure that any one person would agree with everything he writes, but they will be challenged by what he writes. They'll be thinking about what he writes and probably better off for it. My third amazing author that I would just highly recommend for anyone to look at was Henry Nouwen. Henry Nouwen was, or it might be pronounced Henri, but I think a lot of his friends called him Henry. He was a Dutch Catholic priest, an amazing intellect. His interests were psychology and sociology and spiritual development and contemplative Christianity and social justice and pastoral ministry and spiritual growth. I mean, it just goes across the gambit. And he was kind of an activist and a contemplative at the very same time. So his writings just cover so much amazing stuff. He also was an incredibly humble person, and he taught for about 20 years or so at Notre Dame and at Yale Divinity School and at Harvard Divinity School. And then he stepped out of education and worked in a halfway house for developmentally challenged adults. I mean, helping feed people, and he was sent to a lecture circuit, and as he would go to take lectures, he would take some of the residents of the residency where he was at with him, and so he would take these developmentally challenged adults that were struggling, and they would be equal with him. He would have them share their story, and he would share his story. It's just an amazing person. He thought that sometimes out of our weakness, God's able to use that. He wrote a book, Wounded Healer, and how we, like Jesus, can use our wounds to heal others. He just has so much, of so many different categories. I think he wrote 42 books, not counting all of his papers and things like that go with it. So that's my third choice today is Henry Nouwen. Okay, we'll go to number 4. This is John of the Cross. John of the Cross he's been listed as perhaps the greatest of the Spanish poets. He's a 16th century contemplative. He was a part of a conservative order in the church, and he caused a lot of problems. He was very conservative. He wouldn't change his preaching. He wouldn't change his teaching. He caused a lot of jealousy. He brought a lot of people around him. Teresa of Avila was his mentor. They worked together. So probably when I say John of the Cross, I should say John of the Cross and Teresa of Avila, the two of them together, I could put to one. But John of the Cross was captured by his enemies, who were also monks, but were jealous of his conservative order and his type of preaching. And they had a mock trial for him and locked him up in a little dark room, 6 feet by 10 feet. I mean, basically about the size of like an outhouse. And they would bring him out at least once a week to beat him publicly. they would bring him out to make fun of him whenever they had meals. He was allowed to have bread and water, a little bit of salted fish, and he wasn't allowed to change clothes or anything. And he was locked up there in solitary confinement, being made fun of for like 8 months, and then he escaped. During that time, he wrote some of his greatest poetry, and the spiritual canticles that he wrote specifically A Dark Night of the Soul and Ascent to Mount Carmel. His writings are just amazing. I gotta say, though, that John of the Cross is not one of the easier reads. He's 16th century. He lives in a different world. It's hard to understand him. If you're going to tackle John of the Cross, it's probably best to find someone that already is well versed in his writings that can explain it to you. My last theologian for this week is Dietrich Bonhoeffer. Dietrich Bonhoeffer was a Lutheran pastor in Germany and was at the leadership of the Confessing Church movement. Now, in Germany, when Hitler came to power, a lot of churches backed him up. And a lot of churches, they looked the other way when bad things began happening. And they still thought of Hitler, perhaps, or pretended to think of Hitler as being good for the country. And Bonhoeffer didn't have any part of it. He recognized what was going on and was very vocal from early in the start. And because of that, he was torn with where is the place of a man of God in the middle of something like World War II, living in Germany with Hitler. How loud should he be? How loud should he not be? He had a chance to escape to the United States, and he turned it down because he said that if he could not suffer with his people during this time in Germany, then he couldn't go back to Germany after the war and help rebuild. Well, in the end, he was arrested and charged with conspiring against Hitler. He was imprisoned and then later sent to a concentration camp. And right at the tail end of World War II, in 1945, at the age of 39, he was hanged. Just right before he would have been liberated. I think two of his books, probably the most famous book, is The Cost of Discipleship. In that book, Bonhoeffer says, when Christ calls a disciple, he calls him to come and die. Another book that I particularly like is Life Together, where he talks about, he's in prison when he writes it, and he's writing about the community of believers, but that Christianity is both communal and individual. You can't have one without the other and still be faithful to Scripture. With Bonhoeffer, you just read 2 or 3 pages. The books aren't that thick, but you just have to read them 2 or 3 pages at a time and sit and think about them and meditate on them because he is really deep. So these are my 5 authors for this week. Next week, I'll finish up. Well, most of these authors grew deep through adversity. Life's not always a bed of roses for you and me either. And sometimes adversity helps us to grow deep and wide and in the grace of God. And other times we just want to roll over and stop. Well, may God's grace fill you this week. And if this is a time of adversity for you, may God use it, grow you deep. May God bless you, and may God walk with you. And we'll see each other again on Sunday.